Mm.
Okay, sorry about that.
Mm.
Okay, I'm just letting everyone back in. Okay, we're going to start all over again here. Sorry about that. Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut, continuing with Maseh Merkavah, the workings of the chapter. Tonight we are going to be going through chapters 2 through 11 very, very quickly, but to give us an idea of an expanded perspective of the workings of the chariot, even though the most essential part of the vision is in chapter 1. But here we are going to be expanding it to see a broader perspective. So in the end of chapter 1, Yechezkel, because of the awesomeness of the vision, he falls on his face and God speaks to him. He tells him, get up, and a spirit enters into Yechezkel when God is speaking to him. And he tells him, I have made you a prophet, and I am sending you to a very rebellious people. That is how he describes the Jewish people. He tells them, do not be afraid. And at the end, he shows him a scroll, and it's a scroll of lamentations, mourning, woe. And he tells him to eat the scroll. And Yechezkel eats the scroll. We'll return to if we take this literally or symbolically. And Yechezkel finds it sweet on his tongue. That's in the beginning of chapter 3. Then he's commanded to go back to the river Kvar. It's not even clear when he left it. We don't have that timeline. And he goes to a place, Tel Aviv. And like to me, it was a total surprise that the name Tel Aviv is in the Tanakh. It's right here in the 3rd chapter of Yechezkel. And God tells him to stay there for 7 days with the exiles on the river. And then what happens is that God is instructing him, and the theme behind all of this is the upcoming destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. So here we went from this seemingly glorious vision of Yechezkel, and now he's being told about the upcoming destruction. As we've learned many times, all of these kind of destructive prophecies did not have to happen. It was only if the people did not change their ways. And so here, the people always had the chance to change their ways. Nonetheless, God is saying, as it is, the energy is moving towards the destruction of Jerusalem. If we go back to the very first verse of the book of Yechezkel, he says, I am in exile. And we know that he was taken 10 years before the destruction of the temple. Nebuchadnezzar was already ruling over Israel, the Babylonians, but the temple still stood, and most of the Jews were still in Israel. Nebuchadnezzar took call it the cream of the crop, the elite, especially the Kohanim, and exiled them first. And so the context of the whole vision was always this idea of the context of exile. And as we said in the beginning, and I'm just repeating it here, is that one of the reasons that God is showing him this glorious vision is in order to give hope that even in exile, the connection between God and the Jewish people will never be broken. It looks really bad now, but you should know that it will not be broken. And he's given, Yechezkel is given such a glorious vision. So in the 3rd chapter, an extremely important verse is here. And right after this verse, Yechezkel goes back into the vision as described in the 1st verse. And here in the 12th verse of the 3rd chapter, it says, "V'tise'eni ruach v'eshema achrei kol rash gadol, baruch kavod Hashem mimakomo." And a spirit lifted me up, and I heard behind this spirit a voice with a tremendous power. And what did it say? Baruch kavod Hashem mimakomo. Blessed is the glory of God from his place. Now, for those who have been following this series, we discussed this already in relationship with the vision of Isaiah. And we've described all along that Yechezkel is not the only person to experience what is called Ma'aseh Merkavah. He describes it here in one way, but we spent a considerable amount of time with Isaiah's description. And there he sees a God on a throne. He sees 6-winged angels, the seraphim, and they said, Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzavakot, Melo Kol Haaretz Kavodo. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole world is full of his glory. That was the vision of Isaiah. So every day we repeat this combination of Isaiah's vision, holy, 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 and right here in the 3rd chapter of Ezekiel, Baruch Kavod Hashem mimakomo. And as we've described, that if a person is praying on their own, he will be saying this twice a day. If it's with a congregation, it will be repeated 4 times. The idea of combining Isaiah's vision and Ezekiel's vision. So it's really one of the most important verses that comes out of the whole vision of Yechezkel, because we repeat it every day. We don't repeat parts of the whole 1st chapter, but we do repeat this every day. And it's very significant that 2 different descriptions of Maaseh Merkavah are put together by the sages. The sages are the one who saw the connection here, and they put them together, and they put it into our morning and afternoon prayers. It does not appear in the evening prayers. So right after Yechezkel hears this voice saying, blessed is the glory of God from his place, then he goes on and he says that he hears the wings of the Chariot, and they're making a tremendous background noise, and a spirit lifted me up, and it took me and the Spirit of God, the hand of God was heavy upon me. And that's when it says that he goes to Tel Aviv, and he sits there by the river Kvar 7 days. So here, not only is he returning to the physical place of the original vision, but some of the same images. He's seeing the Chariot again. He is experiencing God's glory again. And then, after his 7 days, chapter 3 continues, and God tells him something very important, which applies to every person. He says to him, you must go and warn the people of the upcoming destruction. And he says to him that they are a rebellious people, and they might not listen to you. But your responsibility is to make sure that they understand the ramifications of their being a rebellious people. And he said, if you don't, you are guilty. And that is putting the weight of responsibility on Ezekiel in his role as a prophet. In other words, his job is to warn the people. And God is saying, if I transfer a message to you and you don't give it over to the people, ultimately you will be held responsible because the people weren't rebuked sufficiently or warned about their actions. So obviously, this is, we'll call it a general principle that applies to everyone. That's why we have this saying, all of Israel is responsible one for the other. And that's why in the Torah also, knowing how to give proper rebuke is a mitzvah in the Torah. But it's an art of how to give rebuke in a way that will be actually accepted. And it's given over in Chassidut is if you don't know how to give rebuke in a proper way, then don't give it, because it will end up causing more problems. But here, God is teaching Yechezkel something very important about his prophetic role, and it really applies in certain ways to every single person. Then, in the 22nd verse, it says, and God's hand was upon me again. This phrase is repeated throughout the book of Ezekiel, that God's prophetic presence was very heavy on him. And God tells him to go out into the valley, and there I will speak to you. So it says Yechezkel got up, he goes into the valley, and the glory of God stood before him. And it says, Asher ra'iti al Merkavah ve'apol al panai. And it was just like I was back at the river Kvar, and I fell on my face again. So here, we have to use a lot of imagination to try to understand the timeline here. Because maybe the way I could explain is either, let's say, in a novel or in a movie, where it has what are called flashback scenes. It's telling a story, but it tells a story by going back and forth from present to past, and sometimes even a vision of the future. And sometimes you don't have a full understanding of why it's happening in this order. So it's very similar like this, especially what I just read. Here, he goes back to the river. He's there 7 days. And then God tells him to go to his house. And then he tells him to go out to the plain. And then he has another vision of God. Twice it says he sees the glory of God. And he says it was just like I was back at the river, and he falls on his face. Now, the next 4 chapters are all about different instructions that God is giving to the prophet Ezekiel. And almost all of them have to do with symbolic acts that he tells Yechezkel to do. This is a very, very deep matter here. And it's like a midrash. Sometimes we don't know, should we take this midrash literally or symbolically, metaphorically, allegorically? Sometimes a midrash is meant to be taken literally. But I would say even in most cases, the midrashim are using all kinds of symbolic language in order to get an idea across. And this is true throughout the Talmud also, what's called the Agadata, the stories, the parables, allegories, metaphors that are woven through the Gemara. And these are material for great probing as to what are the meanings of these stories, and how much is it to be taken literally, and how much is it just to teach us a lesson. So here in chapter 4, God tells Ezekiel, take a brick and write and draw on it a map of Jerusalem, and then make a siege wall and a battering ram. It's like he's giving him an art project, a prophetic art project. He's telling him to recreate Yerushalayim, but also the battering ram and the siege walls of the enemy that's going to come and destroy it. And he tells them this is a sign to Israel of what is about to happen. Again, we're 10 years before the actual destruction. But he's showing the prophet a vision of exactly what's going to happen. And then he says to the prophet, lay on your left side for 390 days. And then after 390 days, lay on your right side for 40 days. What is the meaning of this? He says, this is for you to, in a certain way, hold on your shoulders the iniquity of Israel. That's the 390 days, and the 40 days is for the iniquity of Judah. So then he's told to eat bread and drink water only once a day. That is his new diet, only once a day. Then he's told to eat bread with excrement. Then he's told in chapter 5 to shave his head and his beard and to dispose of it by fire, by sword, and by wind. And then he explains to the prophet, this is to symbolize that the people will be destroyed by fire, sword, and wind. So the question is, did these things actually happen? Or are they happening in Yechezkel's mind? And if so, what's the meaning of it? So this gets into a whole fascinating subject that I can only skim the surface here. And we see that many of the prophets were also commanded to do these symbolic acts. And again, it's left for the commentators over millennium to try to understand, did these things happen in reality? Or was it in the vision that God was granting them? And either way, what is the importance of them? Isaiah was commanded to go naked for 3 years. And all the commentaries say there's no way we can understand that Isaiah walked in public naked. There's no way we can understand it that way. So it must mean that some say is he was wearing tattered clothes. And the tattered clothes he was aristocracy, Isaiah. He was part of the royal family. That was like being naked. But all of these symbols, because in the 8th chapter, we're told that in the 6th year, the story begins in the 5th year of the exile that Yechezkel is experiencing. In the 8th chapter, it's the 6th year. So a year has gone by somehow. Well, 390 days is well over a year, and another 40 days is more, and then you add the 7 days, and then he goes out to the plain. So the 390 days is understood. He didn't literally lie for 390 days on his left side. But nonetheless, that's what he was commanded to experience. And then the question about this, and I'm not mentioning, Isaiah was told symbolic acts, Jeremiah, a whole series of different symbolic acts that he did either in private or in front of people. The same thing with Yechezkel. Sometimes it was in private. The ones publicly we take literally. Like Jeremiah was told to take a earthen jar, and he went to the rulers of the time, warned them of the destruction, and then he took it and he broke it in front of them and said, this is what God is telling you. If you don't change your ways, just like I'm breaking this jar, God will break Jerusalem. That was to be taken literally. So what is the importance of symbolic acts? And so here we have a concept, as above, below, but it goes in both directions. We usually quote this idea, as above, below. In other words, what happens in this world is a reflection, is a consequence, is an effect of what is happening in the higher worlds. But one of the major ideas of Judaism is what happens below affects the higher worlds. It's not a one-way street. That is why we pray. That's why we had a service in the temple. That's why we do mitzvot, is not only to affect the upper worlds, but certainly part of it. So when God commands these symbolic acts, the idea is that this is the way, we'll say, potential becomes actual. This is connected to a halacha that we have, that when we pray, the Amida, even though sometimes we refer to it as the silent prayer, we have to be moving our lips and enunciating the words. And even ideally that our ears can hear what we're enunciating. And so the question is, why? Why can't we just mentally do the prayers? Is because it has to have an effect in this world. It can't just be in thought, or it can't just be in the upper worlds. There has to be a corresponding action in this world to bring it into reality. This is a very, very deep understanding of many of the mitzvot that we do, is that we're drawing down spiritual energy into ourselves and into the world by doing the mitzvah. And the mitzvah, in almost all cases, is a physical act with a physical object. And we could ask the question, why don't we do more mitzvah just mentally? I'm just taking an example, putting on tefillin. We could just say the idea is to connect our arm with our heart and our mind. And we could have a nice prayer that says, this is how we should orient ourselves every day. No, we put on these very physical tefillin to draw that energy down into this world. So that was just trying to explain chapters 4 and 5. In chapter 6, and all of these chapters are full of God warning the people, expressing his disappointment, his anger, that the people have turned away from God, have turned away from Torah, turned away from morals and ethics. But in the 6th chapter, God promises Yechezkel, there will always be a remnant. No matter how far off the Jewish people go and how destructive the effect will be, there will always be a remnant. That's in chapter 6. Chapter 7 is very dramatic. God comes and repeats over and over again, the end has come. The time of the end has come. He's warning Yechezkel, all of these rebukes and warnings of danger, they don't seem to be working, and we're getting closer and closer to the destruction. Then we come to chapter 8. And this is very, very important, because here Yechezkel goes back into what we would call Ma'aseh Merkavah. And here it says it's in the 6th year, in the 6th month, the 5th day. He was sitting in his house with the elders of Yehuda. Remember, they're in exile, pre-destruction, but they're already in exile. And he's sitting and he's talking with them, and he says, the hand of God came upon me, and he sees a likeness of fire, and what appeared, he's now having this vision of the man sitting on the throne again. And here he sees the chashmal again. This is the 3rd mention of the chashmal, I believe. The word chashmal is only mentioned 3 times in the entire Tanakh, and they're all in the vision of Yechezkel, but not all in the 1st chapter. That's part of my point here. He sees the chashmal again. And then he says he sees the shape of a hand. And it took me by a lock of my hair, and the wind lifted me up above the earth and the heaven, and it brought me in the visions of God to Yerushalayim. So this is the first time. This is in the 8th chapter. After all of these warnings from God about what's going to happen to Yerushalayim, here, and it says it's clear, in the vision of God, God picks him up by his hair and transports him to Yerushalayim. And he takes him to the inner gate that is looking towards the north. The north always represents that evil comes from the north. That was in a vision to Jeremiah. And Yechezkel sees a vision of the glory of God. And it says, and it was the same vision that I had when I was in the plain. And when he was in the plain, he said, this was the same vision I had on the river Kavar. So you see how the vision of the chariot is playing itself out over a minimum of over a year. He keeps on going back into the vision. God keeps on bringing him back into this vision. Now, as we go further, and I see already we're not going to be able to get to it this week, this idea that we're starting to develop here will become one of the major ideas of understanding the inner story of what's happening here. Between this glorious vision, which Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan is explaining as a description of a meditative formula, a meditative method. And that is what's called Maaseh Merkavah. And the other theme is that many of the images that he's being shown in the vision have to do with fire and destruction. This is a theme that we're gonna expand upon, and I believe will get us to the heart of this vision. So here, Yechezkel in the 8th chapter, he is in the temple in Jerusalem. And God, and then it's a long part of chapter 8, God says, look yourself, look at the abominations that the people are doing here in the temple. The temple still stands. But why is it about to be destroyed? Is because the service in the temple has become empty. It has become corrupt. It has become hypocritical. The people have turned away from God, turned away from the Torah. And so in chapter 8, he's saying, look what's happening here. Do you understand why they are bringing down destruction upon their own heads? Then we go to chapter 9, and it's part of the same vision of Yechezkel in Jerusalem. And here he sees a man clothed in linen. So we understand that he's seeing an angel. It's in ancient times to be clothed in linen was considered like a very expensive, honorable way of dressing. So he sees this man clothed in linen, and God tells him, go make a mark on the forehead of those who sigh because of the abominations of what are happening in Jerusalem. In other words, go find all the righteous people who are not part of these abominations, who are not part of turning away from God. Make a mark on their foreheads. And then he tells this here, we're in chapter 10 now. In chapter 9 is about making the mark. And then in chapter 10, God says to this man in linen, go and slay all the other people. And it's almost like he's the angel of death. And a terrible slaughter begins to happen. But the righteous have a mark on them, and they will be saved. Remember, back in the 6th chapter, God says there will always be a remnant. There will always be a remnant. Here, Yechezkel cries out and says, God, are you going to destroy the whole people? He's again, this is all in a vision. It's not happened in reality, because the destruction only happens a little bit later. But Yechezkel cries out in anguish, God, are you going to destroy all of the people? And here, a new element is introduced that we will only get to next week, but it will be shown to be one of the most important elements in the entire vision. And that is a new type of angel is introduced here. And they are the Kruvim. The Kruvim. And here in chapter 10, the Kruvim are introduced, and virtually the entire 10th chapter is almost a repeat of chapter 1. But the difference is the Kruvim have replaced the Chariot, the original living being angels. They're still the wheel angels are mentioned, but the Kruvim become the main element in his vision. And like I said, the entire chapter 10 is almost like a repeat of the first chapter, except the Kruvim have replaced the Chariot. And and they have 4 faces, but something very significant happens here. And that is, if you remember in chapter 1, the Chariot had 4 faces of a human being, an ox, a lion, and an eagle. Here, the ox has been replaced by the Kruvim. And so all the commentaries asked, it's discussed in the Talmud, how did that happen? And so the answer, and we actually touched on this already, that the ox is a remembrance of the golden calf. And that it says that Yechezkel prayed that the image of the ox would be taken away and would be replaced by the Kruvim. And it happened. And so here, again, this is a heavenly vision, but through Yechezkel's prayer, he's able to change the energy, not only below, but above. This is in a certain way, a heavenly vision he's being granted here. But his prayer changes the reality. The ox is now replaced. Again, we don't have the time to go through all of chapter 10. But here we'll see that Yechezkel is deep back into the vision. Back into the vision. But he's in Yerushalayim when all of this is happening. in his vision. And then it says that, again, he sees the glory of God was above all of this. And it says that the living creatures, the Chariot, that he had originally seen, if you remember in chapter 1, the main kind of angel were the Chariot. And here he says that this living creature that I saw under the God of Israel by the river Kavar, and I knew that they were Kruvim. So here the Chariot have been transformed in his mind into these Kruvim. So it goes without saying that is where we're going next week. We are going to go into great depth as to who are these Kruvim and what do they represent, and more than that, what can it tell us about the very essence of the vision of the chariot? But just to end tonight, so in chapter 11, and this I'm going to read this in English, and we could see like how heavy the book of Yechezkel has gotten. They're on the precipice of tremendous destruction. So much so that in the vision, Yechezkel screams out, like, God, are you going to slay the whole people? And so in the 11th chapter, there is just an absolutely beautiful, call it promise from God. And it's in the 16th verse of the 11th chapter. Therefore, say, thus says God, although I have cast them far off among the nations, and he's really talking about all of Jewish history that's going to follow, not just what's going to happen right there. Again, although I have cast them far off among the nations, and although I have scattered them among the countries, and I have been to them a little sanctuary in the countries where they have come, therefore say, thus says God, yet will I gather you from the peoples and assemble you out of the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel, and they shall come there, and they shall take away all the detestable things of it, and all the abominations of it from there. And I will give them one heart. This prophecy is absolutely one of the most beautiful of all of the prophets. And I will give them one heart, and I will put a new spirit within you, and I will take away the heart of stone out of their flesh, and I will give them a heart of flesh, that they may walk in my statutes and keep my ordinances and do them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. But then he says, but as for them whose heart follows after the heart of their detestable things and their abominations, I will recompense their way upon their own heads, says God. So here, this is something that we've discussed many times. The language of the Bible is that God is punishing the people. That's why, unfortunately, many people have this view of God as being a zealous God, a punishing God, a zealous God, even a cruel God. But here he explains what we've talked about all the time. It's mida keneged mida. he says that I will recompense their way upon their own heads, says God. In other words, they are bringing it upon themselves. I am doing it, but I'm their mirror. We learned this last week. I'm their shadow. And they have acted in a despicable way, and they have brought upon themselves destruction. And that is what it's going to be. But God says, but I will always save a remnant, and ultimately, I will not only be their God and you'll be my people, but God will give us a new spirit. He'll take out our heart of stone and give us a heart of flesh. So that's in the 11th chapter. And then towards the end of the 11th chapter, it says, again, he sees the glory of God. And then a spirit comes and lifts him up. And again, it says in a vision. So in other words, all of this is happening in a vision. This whole thing from chapter 8 to 11, it's all in a vision, and it's all part really of Maseh Merkavah. And then in this vision, he brings him back to the exiles where they were. And it says that the vision leaves him. And the 11th chapter says, then he related to the people everything he had seen. And that's how chapter 11 ends. And in a certain way, that's how Maaseh Merkavah really ends. The rest of the book of Ezekiel is about many, many, many other things. It, of course, is one of the most important of all of the books. But our purpose isn't to learn the whole book of Ezekiel. So just to end this class, the purpose of going through these chapters is we've really developed two ways of understanding this vision. A good part of our discussions have really followed the idea of Maaseh Merkavah being a vehicle for spiritual and mystical elevation, of rising to higher levels of consciousness. This is a theme that Rabbi Kaplan develops in great depth. And you can read the whole chapter 1 in this light, that these are instructions of mystical, spiritual meditations that, like a chariot, take us to higher levels of consciousness and bring us to be closer to God. We also analyzed the whole vision as seeing that all of the elements of the vision are teaching us about the very fabric of the physical and spiritual universe. We devoted much time to analyzing each and every one of the symbolic images as it reveals how this world works in a physical way and in a spiritual way. So that's all one, we'll call it one way of understanding this vision. But the other is there has been a context from the first verse through the 11th chapter that this whole vision is happening as part of the upcoming destruction of Jerusalem. And that is what we've done tonight by going through chapters 2 to 11. We see that became the major theme now, that the different images that Yechezkel has been seeing has been now mixed up with all of these instructions of how to try to warn the people and rebuke the people of what is going to come if they don't change their ways. And so here we really have two parallel, true ways of seeing this vision. And that leads to a certain amount of paradox. And that, of course, we developed in great depth with the understanding of the chashmal. Chash meaning silent, mal meaning speaking. And so the fact that this is the only place in the Tanakh that this word appears, chashmal, is telling us that there's something very paradoxical about the entire vision. Not just who these chashmal are, but the entire understanding of what Yechezkel is being taught here has like two parallel sets of teachings and symbolisms. So that makes the whole vision very paradoxical. The Kruvim, who we introduced tonight, that is where we're going to next week. The Kruvim will become key to understanding this paradox that's running through the vision of Yechezkel. And hopefully I've whetted everyone's appetite, so you'll come next week, because there we will discuss the Kruvim and try in a certain way to put together the whole vision. After that, we are going to, in a certain way, switch gears, and we are going to look at different stories in the Talmud about Maaseh Merkavah, and we are going to add a number of incredible teachings from Rav Ginsburg about Maaseh Merkavah. So I hope you will all look forward to this as much as I am. Okay. L'chaim, everyone, l'chaim. In a certain way, I was hoping to get to the Kruvim tonight to like put it together, but we will get there next week. And for everyone who's watching and who will be watching, next week is like a really, God willing, a really, really important class as to kind of putting the whole vision together as to the bigger context. Okay, so first of all,